Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast introduction to today's Thomas Jefferson Hour. This one is with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky about monuments. What should we do with them? Should we pluck them down? Should we retire them? Should we contextualize them? What do they signify? Is it fair for us in our time to use our judgments of history to revise or discredit things from 100 years ago or more? Which monuments obviously must go? Who should be at the table to make these decisions, etc.? It's a fascinating conversation. In fact, I think this is one of the most important Jefferson Hours that we have done, so I hope that you'll listen to it and recommend it to your friends. You might not agree with everything. I don't agree with everything that we said. I don't even agree with everything that I said in the program, but Lindsay has thought about this. I get asked about this, of course, all the time, all the way up to Mount Rushmore and the Jefferson Memorial. But we use some examples of what we both regard as extremely thoughtful, creative, responsible adjustments in the public square. For example, the George Mason monument at George Mason University, or removing the Theodore Roosevelt statue group at the American Museum of Natural History, or the way the American Museum of African Americans has handled the Jefferson Declaration of Independence paradox. So some good examples here and some statistics. Amazing. There are still 700 Confederate monuments in this country. About 120 or so have come down really in the last 15 years, and probably more to come, although we may have sort of watched that wave move at its most potent through American life. I want to, just as we prepare for today's program, talk about a couple of more. One is the Lewis and Clark Camp Disappointment Monument near Browning, Montana, put up by the Great Northern Railroad. It's an obelisk. This is where Lewis was looking for the source of the Marias River, which he named. He thought it would be in Canada. It wasn't. It was just east of Glacier National Park, and he was hoping that it rose in Canada, this tributary of the Missouri, because it would drive back the Canadian border. When he discovered that it didn't, he called the place where he stopped Camp Disappointment, and unfortunately there they met 8 young Blackfeet, Piegan Blackfeet men, and a skirmish occurred at dawn, and Lewis and Clark wound up killing 2 of them, one with a knife, that wasn't Lewis, and one with a gun, that was Lewis. This was the only bloodshed of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Unfortunate. I think Jefferson would have been disappointed with Lewis for going up into that territory with so few men. He took just 3 men with him on that side excursion in late July 1806. So there's an obelisk that's been there forever, but the Blackfeet, who call themselves sometimes the Pecuni or the Piegan, they've spray painted the monument and said Blackfeet country or Pecuni land, and it's defaced it in some important ways, but I also think it's quite appropriate. I mean, nobody asked the Blackfeet whether they wanted this monument to the white penetration of their homeland on their homeland. Didn't rip it down. They didn't explode it. It does have a few bullet holes, but those could have been anybody, and more particularly probably white ranchers. They defaced it in a way that could be repaired if you really wanted to scrub all of that off. But they're saying this isn't the right historical interpretation of this spot. We're going to revise it with our own interpretation. And if you don't like it, well, tough. You didn't ask us. We're not asking you. So that's interesting, I think. Another one is where Sitting Bull was killed on December 15th, 1890. It's on the North Dakota-South Dakota border on the Grand River. I've been there a number of times. I regard it as a kind of a sacred pilgrimage. There is some signage put up by the South Dakota Historical Society. It's not very sensitive. It talks about Sitting Bull as sort of a shapeshifter, a kind of a shaman, but maybe a misguided one. It's one of those signs that were made in metal, so that sort of bas relief. The letters stand out from the black background. And Lakota individuals have gone in with files and filed off some of the terms that they find objectionable to their own interpretation of the life and achievement of Sitting Bull. It's amazing. I think it's absolutely appropriate. Officials probably didn't like it much when it was reported to them, but it is, I think, a very meaningful revision. And when you see it, you get to see both the original intention of the white person who wrote the sign, probably in the 1930s, 40s, or 50s, and you get to see the rewriting of it using a file, using a fairly blunt instrument by people who have reason to object to that Eurocentric, that white person's interpretation. And together they make for a more interesting monument. It's not the end of the world. You could replace the sign. I hope they don't. I hope that sign always stays there because it shows different interpretations over time Now, you could put up a second group of signs now, not too many. I wouldn't want to damage the solemnity of the site, but you see the point, so that there are many ingenious ways to go about this that are this side of dynamite or C4. And not everything has to be plucked down, but in most cases, the argument can be made quite legitimately that a monument to Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson or Jefferson Davis, or for that matter, Theodore Roosevelt or Thomas Jefferson, should come down. And it's not inconceivable to me that the Jefferson Memorial, for example, will at least be heavily reinterpreted, and maybe some of the incised statements on the walls, which are taken really, I think, badly out of context, could be replaced, or draperies could go over them, or the rangers could be taught to provide a more nuanced discussion. So this conversation with Lindsay ranges across a lot of space. In preparing for it, I asked her that both of us attempt to be as careful as we possibly could to provide historians' guidance to thinking about this. In other words, saying it doesn't do any good to say this one should go and that one should stay, and this is why. I think it's more important to say here are ways to kind of think about this, or here are possible strategies for this sort of thing. But what we both agreed on from the beginning is that a statue is intentional. They don't just happen. Even if you created them with a 3D printer, it would still take design and fulfillment. But they're created with bronze. There's casting. It's expensive. There has to be a pedestal. There has to be a language. It has to be approved by the city council or some other official entity. This is a community effort. And so why do you choose to portray X and not 7 other individuals? So if it's Columbus, Ohio, and you're kind of saying, what would be a good statue? You think Columbus. But then we also offer in this conversation, well, maybe there are some things that you should think about. So the first impulse is, we're Columbus. Let's put up a statue of Christopher Columbus. But then you hope that at the table are some people who would say, well, wait a minute. Let's really think about this. What are the possible unintended consequences? Who might this offend or annoy? How will this be seen in 50 years? Do we need a devil's advocate, as you see in the creation of saints in the Catholic Church? Do we need someone to research everything that can be said against Christopher Columbus or against Thomas Jefferson or against Sacagawea or against Eleanor Roosevelt before we do the hard work and great expense of creating a bronze permanent monument to this individual? So think it through, think carefully about it, understand that historical moods and perspectives change over time, and that almost nobody in the history of the world is so saint-like that somebody couldn't bring up a significant reason to discredit that individual, even Gandhi, even Martin Luther King. Anyway, it's a fascinating show. I'm very proud of this. I love my friendship with Lindsay Chervinsky, and I hope that you find this useful too. I know we're going to get some hate mail, but I hope the conversation that comes out of this is more important than the unpleasant reactions of a few. So let's go to the show. I am so grateful to all of you for listening. Please let us know what you think. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Seated across from me, at least virtually, is our great friend, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Today we want to talk about cancel culture and the culture wars, with a particular emphasis on monuments and historical memorials. So, Lindsay, welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
I mean, both of us have been asked about this a million times in our public lives. What should we do about these monuments? Should we tear down Confederate monuments? Where does it stop? I mean, isn't this our history? We're erasing our heritage, and who gets to decide these questions, and etc. And so we're kind of at an inflection point here. And what I want to do today with you is to bring a careful, reasoned, historical perspective to this. And so here are some of the questions. Who gets to decide what stays up or comes down? Is there any justification for violence or vandalism? Plucking down a statue in the middle of the night, or throwing blood on a statue of Christopher Columbus, or like Saddam Hussein's statue, there's people just roping it and pulling it down in the public square. What happens to the removed monuments? Do we melt them down? Do we put them in a special museum? President Trump wanted a theme park for discredited monuments, and that's not necessarily the worst idea. What is the possibility of new interpretive signage at the site? So keep the monument, but surround it with a kind of more nuanced, certainly more fair set of interpretive panels, or counter statues, counter monuments. How do you answer the argument that our history is our history, and that erasing it is a silly kind of thing to do, self-indulgent? It's kind of virtue signaling, but our history is our history, and those monuments might even be useful in provoking public conversation about the extraordinary path that we've been on since 1776. And then what do we do about the big ones like Stone Mountain in Georgia or Mount Rushmore? I mean, it's one thing to pull down a statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville and place it somewhere else, but should we even consider in a sober and thoughtful way blasting Thomas Jefferson off the mountain in South Dakota, or those 3 Confederates from Stone Mountain in Georgia? So I hope that sort of begins to cover the ground. And this was precipitated by reading that several law schools are changing their name from John Marshall to something else because he's now regarded in some circles as toxic, not just because of his ownership of slaves and certain decisions he made about the slave trade, but also the famous Marshall Trilogy, which helped to dispossess Native Americans across the American continent. So welcome to the program. Give us just an opening thought about how we as historians should carefully think about this.
When I'm thinking about a statue or a monument or whatever it is, I think about 5 factors. So the first is, what is this statue celebrating? Not who, but what. So for example, we celebrate Thomas Jefferson not because he owned enslaved individuals. In spite of that, we celebrate him because of the Declaration of Independence and his role in the new nation and the Declaration of Human Rights and the University of Virginia. And then there are also a lot of other terrible things we have to grapple with. But those are the things that we put up monuments to him to celebrate.
Number 1, what are we signifying?
Yes, what are we signifying? And I think that's particularly important when we get into some statues about like Robert E. Lee. So we can come back to this idea. Number 2, where is this thing? Maybe it makes more sense to rethink John Marshall statues if they're just kind of, in the middle of a random square or on a street. But if it's a law school and there's a real tie to that concept, I think the location is important. So number 2 is where. Number 3 is, how do the various stakeholders feel? And stakeholder is a term in the public history discipline that means all of the various people that have some sort of ownership. So let's say we're talking about a statue outside of a museum. The people who work at the museum, the people who maybe endowed the statue, the descendants of the person who's depicted, the people who live in the neighborhood, who walk by it, these are all various stakeholders. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all of their opinions should have the same weight or the same impact on the decision-making process, but I do think they all have to be taken into account. Number 4 is, it is totally appropriate that things change over time, that our society and our values change over time. And so it is, I think, right and just to occasionally step back and say, is this still something we want to be celebrating? And I think the answer can be yes, no, maybe, and we'll figure it out. And number 5 is there any artistic value to this thing? My favorite example, there is a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a Confederate general, and he was the first Grand Master of the Ku Klux Klan. And there was a statue of him that was taken down, I think in the maybe in 2011. It was put up in the 1990s. And it is ghastly. It is the ugliest statue that has ever existed in all of humanity. And I know that that's a big statement, but it is really, really bad. So if something is problematic and also has no artistic value, I do think that's okay for us to take that part into it as well. So those are my 5 factors.
I like that very much as a plan. Here are mine. There's 6 of them, so we'll see how they relate. 1, there's no single standard for the entire country. I'm sure you agree with that. Number 2, these have to be local decisions. It's not for the government of the United States in Washington to make a law. You must replace every Confederate statue with one of a Native American or a slave. etc. There's no single standard, and these need to be locally determined. Number 3, the whole man theory, and that's sort of what you were pointing to anyway. So we're not celebrating Jefferson, the slaveholder. We're celebrating Jefferson, America's Renaissance man, or the author of the most important document in American history. And it's not that his status as a slaveholder isn't mightily important, but the whole man, the whole woman theory suggests that we need a broader evaluatory lens than just to say, I object to this in this person, I object to that in that person. Number 4, we should at least consider the possibility of teachable moments, that maybe retaining an objectionable thing allows us to interpret it in a really meaningful way with seminars, with symposia, with publications, with interpretive signage, with counter statues, and so on. Number 5, we cannot erase our history. The question is, how should we commemorate it? So, of course, we all get, and this was your point too, we all understand that you don't change our history by removing Robert E. Lee from Charlottesville's pedestal, but it does tell you something about how you now look on questions that were once looked at in a very different light. And then finally, who shall escape whipping? If you really decided to get absolutely rigorous about this and said anybody whose existence in a public square might offend somebody for some reason, nothing would remain. It's impossible to imagine, if you believe that the human condition is mixed and not altogether positive, it's impossible to imagine anyone who could survive a kind of I object sort of scrutiny. So let me just give you one example, Lindsay, before we continue our conversation. I was involved in one of these projects to put up a statue of Theodore Roosevelt at the courthouse lawn in Jenkinson, North Dakota. He ranched and cowboyed out there for 4 years. He later said it was the most important single experience of his life. I was involved in helping to create the Theodore Roosevelt Center at Dickinson State University. We're digitizing all of Roosevelt. He gave his first great national speech on that very spot in 1886. And so we commissioned a statue. And what I learned is this. These are intentional. This is a very intentional thing to do. This is not something that just happens. And they're expensive. And even when you've decided that it's Roosevelt, you have to decide, how shall we depict him? What time in his life was this? Are there things that we would rather not emphasize in this monument? So there's a set of politics that goes into this at every level. And by the time this happens, you have to get permission from the city. There are zoning commissions involved. You have to hire an artist. The artist will have his or her own views of what's appropriate. The community has to accept this. There may be protests. And so today, if I were doing this now, this was done 15 years ago, I would be more likely to say maybe we shouldn't do it at all, because Roosevelt was an imperialist. He has a decidedly mixed record on race. He said some terrible things about American Indians whose land the monument statue is on, that maybe we're asking for more trouble than we're gaining because of all the things that we could have spent $150,000 making happen. Why Theodore Roosevelt? Why Robert E. Lee? Why Christopher Columbus? Why Magellan? Why John C. Fremont? Why Sacagawea, for that matter, or Sitting Bull, or Crazy Horse? And so I think what people need to remember as we go to our first break is that every statue is a very serious investment, and it shows great intentionality. Our lists are quite similar, I think, and I think you agree about the intentionality of a statue. So give us a couple of examples. I mentioned Roosevelt in western North Dakota. I think you want to point to Roosevelt in New York City.
Yes, so there was a statue of Theodore Roosevelt outside the Museum of National History, and it depicted Roosevelt on horseback, and there was one man to his right that was designed to look like a African American, and one man to his left that was designed to look like a Native American, and they were on foot. And the statue itself was, I think, fairly well designed. It was outside this museum that Roosevelt sort of had an affinity or an affiliation, and it made sense thematically that perhaps he should be there. But it conveyed a racial hierarchy that we in the 21st century should be uncomfortable with. Now, Roosevelt was not uncomfortable with this racial hierarchy. He would have very much agreed. But today, that's not really acceptable. And so what was very interesting about the conversation surrounding this statue, and I have a link that sort of describes it that hopefully we can put in the show notes. The museum actually grew to be uncomfortable with the statue because they felt like they couldn't provide this sort of information and the contextualization that was required where the statue was positioned because it was outside the actual building. And Roosevelt's descendants actually said, take it down. Roosevelt wouldn't have cared about statues. That was not his thing. We are fine with this going. We don't believe that it represents our values in the 21st century. Let's take it. So I think that is a really good example of when, where, how, what is it celebrating? What does it suggest to the American people? How do the various stakeholders feel about this thing? That, I think, came to a pretty good resolution for a lot of people in a way that is understandable and nuanced and thoughtful.
We need to take a short break. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, our conversation with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky about monuments and statues in American memory. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm sitting across from Lindsay Chervinsky. Lindsay, you were mentioning the statue in front of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, the statue group of Theodore Roosevelt on horseback, flanked on one side by a Native American, barefoot, and flanked on the other side by an African gun bearer, barefoot. That's been cringeworthy in my mind since I first visited the museum, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, is this the best possible way of showing T.R. the naturalist? His father helped to create the American Museum of Natural History. Roosevelt provided specimens and support. It was one of the institutions that he most prized, and many of the artifacts from Roosevelt's life are in the vaults or on display at the American Museum. And so if you're a naturalist who's interested in giraffes and elephants and bison and grizzly bears and so on, in what sense are a Native American and an African gun bearer part of that story? It almost suggests that they too are specimens of natural history, which could be highly objectionable in any rational person's mind. But secondly, it's clearly a message about the white man's burden in the world. He's on horseback, he's leading these natives into a better future, and they're following dutifully. We no longer really appreciate that point of view. It was a beautifully designed statue. The sculptor was James Earl Fraser, who's a marvelous turn-of-the-century sculptor. He gave us an even more important American icon, the end of the trail, the famous icon of the Native American slumped over his horse with his lance dragging on the ground. A couple of great things there. First of all, there were stakeholders, including the Roosevelt family at the table. The museum had already done a symposium and interior interpretation of this to try to contextualize it and to use it as a teachable moment. They eventually decided, no, that it was just not in keeping with their current vision, not fair to Roosevelt, not fair to the idea of a museum of natural history. And so they determined, after doing all of the really important legwork, care, deliberation, stakeholders, internal debate, attempts to find ways to maybe keep it at that point, and then at that point only did they decide to remove it. That seems like it is exemplary and should almost be the template for this sort of monument decision, don't you think?
I do, and if I can give another example of a similarly positive process that I think would be very illustrative for how other sites might approach this conversation. At George Mason University's campus, they have a statue of George Mason that is designed to highlight his contributions to human rights and the ideas sort of that eventually went into the Constitution. Unlike the museum, which was limited by the facade of the museum itself, where the statue was located, there weren't that many opportunities to contextualize outside. This statue of George Mason is in the middle of a quad on campus, and so there's a lot of space around it. And what the school did after a lot of study and conversation and meetings is they have put up these unbelievable silhouettes around the outside of the square, and they're sort of a black steel, and so they look like, if you are familiar with those portrait silhouette things, it looks like a full body of that, and they are of the various enslaved individuals that Mason owned. And because we don't have portraits of them, this is a good way to sort of demonstrate who they are. And you can look through the intentional designed gaps in these silhouettes and see Mason through them. And because there's enough space, you can have all these things without removing egress through the square or putting something on the statue. And I think it presents such a compelling full picture in a way that I think most people are really satisfied with. And so that is a great option if you have it. It's just that a lot of places don't allow for that kind of creative use of space.
That's an outstanding, even brilliant analysis, Lindsay. First of all, it's George Mason University, so there had to be deep reluctance just to pluck him off and throw him in the landfill. It's George Mason University. You have to go all the way. You're going to change the name of the university if you're going to repudiate the founder. He was a slaveholder. He was a friend and neighbor of George Washington. Jefferson regarded him as the American Cato, like that he was a crabby, absolutist believer in limited government and bills of rights and so on. So he worshipped him nearly, but he said he's kind of a craggy guy. So here's this important university named for this person. We now know he was a slaveholder. Options: change the name of the university, pluck down the statue and do something else, or just live through this wave of revisionism and righteousness. But they did this incredible thing. They kept the statue, but you had to look at it through enslaved people. So you couldn't go there without being forced to think, oh, among other things, this extraordinary American owned human people. It seems to me that that's exactly the most extraordinary good sense in approaching something like this. As you say, it can't be done everywhere because of space limitations. I just find myself admiring these two examples of the American Museum of Natural History on the one hand because of the process that they undertook, and then George Mason for what I would regard as a very highly responsible approach. However, let's just say that I'm a 25-year-old African American and I am deeply offended by the lingering American memory of slavery and how I can't go anywhere without being reminded of this. The President of the United States the other night in his State of the Union message said that every black parent has to give the talk to their children, that if you get stopped on the road, you could die, that you have to go through a special set of subservient protocols to ensure that you're going to survive a routine traffic stop. I might say nuts to that. I don't care what you surround this thing by. I'm going to go in the middle of the night and I'm going to knock that thing down, or I'm going to paint over it, because I don't have to put up with that, even the way people in power have now contextualized it. Can you find a justification at any point for people using serious vandalism, not just graffiti that can be erased, but serious vandalism or iconoclasm to destroy these monuments?
This is where I think the stakeholder part of the conversation is really important, because I can do my best to identify with what that feels like, but I'm white. I can do my best to sympathize, but I can't actually know what it feels like.
And pretending to know what it feels like can also be offensive, because how can you possibly ever have an equivalent moral outrage?
I think I can be as open-minded as possible, and I can be as sympathetic as possible, and I can try and uplift voices who have that experience as opposed to trying to speak for them, which is, I think, the most important thing to do. And I can understand why there's no amount of contextualization that some people will be okay with. I don't know. I really struggle with it because I don't want to condone violence. I don't want to condone destruction of property. Usually the people that end up having to deal with it or pay to fix it are not the people that you want to end up having to deal with it or paying to fix it. It often comes out of local revenue, and that's local taxpayers, which is not really helpful. In that case, I don't really have an answer, because I can understand all sides and I can see value in all of the arguments.
I think you're about to say you will not rule out, in certain circumstances, violence.
This is an example where the whole man theory is kind of important. I guess I would argue that, again, with the George Mason statue was not put up because he was a slaveholder. The best known example recently is, of course, the Robert E. Lee statue.
Charlottesville, of course, the famous incident in 2017 that was a pivotal moment in the history of the Trump presidency.
It was. So, a couple of things of context that I think are really important to note. This statue was put up in 1890. So Lee had been dead for 20 years at that point. The statue was in the center of town. It was almost impossible to go through Charlottesville without seeing it. It was enormous. So there was not really a way to contextualize, like we talked about with the Mason statue, because it was so huge. You just couldn't put anything even on par. Otherwise you would have these like giant things all over town. When we think about what is it we are celebrating, what Robert E. Lee is best known for is fighting against the Union. He was a traitor. He was fighting to secede from the Union, and he was fighting to preserve slavery. That doesn't mean he didn't do other things in his life, but that is what he is best known for. And we know that that is what is being celebrated because when the statue was put up, the speeches that were given to commemorate it were glorifying and were celebrating white supremacy explicitly.
The intention of the creators is important. If those who had built this monument had said, we know the South was wrong, we know that trying to perpetuate slavery was a bad idea, people fight for their home states, and Robert E. Lee agonized over which side to join here. He had a certain character as a human being. So in spite of everything, we think this is somebody that is important for American memory. That's one thing. But to say, we are still defiant, this was a war of northern aggression, this was really about states' rights, it wasn't about slavery at all. Those two intentions are quite different, aren't they?
They are, and the intention is depicted in the design. He is depicted on horseback in uniform. This is not showing someone who is anguished about the course of the nation or someone who is torn between two sides. With that intention in mind, with the timing of when it was put up, which was
Black Codes, Jim Crow, the South doing everything in its power to disenfranchise African Americans.
And this was part of that because it's near the courthouse. And so it was very much a demonstration of white supremacy in both practice, lived experience, and of course also judicial codes. With all that context in mind, with what this is supposed to symbolize, and the reason we know that it still symbolizes that today is because it was the ideal place for a white supremacy rally in 2017. That was why they wanted to go there, was because it symbolizes these things. I have a much harder time telling people, especially people of color, whose ancestors, many of whom were enslaved in Virginia, no, you should not defile the statue with paint. I am a rule follower, but I really have trouble telling people that. I just really do.
Well, just remember that the only death that occurred at the Charlottesville incident was of a white supremacist using his car to attack a crowd in which a woman was killed. So property damage is not the same as human damage. And we have to remember that what Robert E. Lee represents to almost all black people and to many white people is a systematic attempt to enslave people of another race forever if possible, and to feel nostalgia and lamentation that somehow the world changed out from under them, and to believe that a war which was begun by traitors can literally be called a war of northern aggression. So I want to move to a more successful example, if I might. The Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., I find to be a stunning place. Both of us are Jefferson scholars. There's a statue of Jefferson. The famous preamble to the Declaration of Independence is inscribed in giant letters in magnificent lighting. You can't go into that room without seeing Jefferson's universalist ideal that all human beings, irrespective of the accidents of their birth, are equal in the eyes of God and should be accorded equal rights under natural law. And yet then there are these bricks with the names of 600 of his enslaved people. It's magnificent because it doesn't say, how dare Jefferson ever have lived? It doesn't say we must erase him and never think about him again. It says he launched this magnificent Enlightenment ideal imperishably with the best possible language, and we celebrate that. And yet, he owned human beings, and here, in a very modest and non-confrontational way, are their names. And for most people who walk into that museum, they have never heard of any enslaved person at Monticello except possibly Sally Hemings. And so it actually gives names and agency to people that were otherwise statistics in Jefferson's farm book. I don't know what you feel about that one, but I love it.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I mean, I think that museum is so, to say it's well done feels like such an understatement because it's so meticulously thought through in every way, from how you approach and the lighting and the spacing and the use of culture and culinary elements. I mean, it's so spectacularly thoughtful, which in a lot of ways is actually, I've heard an argument that like we just shouldn't have monuments at all. We shouldn't have statues at all. And instead we should have museums, because they are the type of space that allows for that type of presentation, which is the type of presentation we should be looking for, which does tell the full story and includes all of the lives. And it doesn't erase people or cancel people, but it puts it into context, which I think is so valuable. Even if we do our very best to put on seminars or classes or offer materials or you name it around whatever these statues are, to do our best to contextualize them, at best, we're only reaching a very small percentage of the people who actually interact with that statue. We have to think about what it tells to people who maybe are just passing by, what sort of impression it gives to people, but then also for those who maybe are young, children who are still learning what questions to ask, what does it tell them about history that they maybe don't know to question yet? To give another example, there's a statue of Lincoln in Boston. Next to Lincoln, there is a formerly enslaved person who is supposed to be depicted as breaking out of bondage. That was the idea behind it. What it looks like is Lincoln standing next to a man kneeling at his feet in chains, if you don't know the larger story. To give credit where credit is due, I've heard Annette Gordon-Reed, who is a fantastic Jeffersonian historian, talk about her experiences with this statue. And when her children were younger, they asked, why does that man who looks like Daddy, why is he on his knees? So I think that's a really good example of, here's a woman who's wildly educated, her husband is wildly educated, very successful, was able to explain it to their children, but it gives an uncomfortable impression to people who maybe wouldn't necessarily know that history. And so these are the things we have to be thinking about if a statue is in a public place.
You know this history. I know this history. My knowledge is highly imperfect. But if I'm a parent from Cincinnati and we wind up in Charlottesville because we want to see the great Jefferson home at Monticello, and we're in the middle of the street and my child says, "Daddy, who is that woman behind Lewis and Clark and why is she crouching?" If I don't know the story, I might say, well, the way they're protecting her, defending her in some way. She understands that these are powerful men. We all have to do this. We all have to surmise what's going on. We have to try to read the statue. And if you don't know the history, you might read it in a way that confirms her subordination. And so the statue can inadvertently give a signal that's not quite the one you had in mind. Let me give you another example, Lindsay. We have a couple of minutes here. Oakley, Kansas, there is a statue of Buffalo Bill Cody on horseback shooting a buffalo, much, much larger than life. And he's aiming his beautiful Sharps rifle at a buffalo, and the buffalo is running away from him, and it's clear that he's about to kill this buffalo. He was a buffalo killer. He fed the Kansas Railroad. He was in a contest. He became Buffalo Bill by shooting more buffalo in a single day than the other Buffalo Bill, and he was feeding these railroad workers. It was essentially U.S. policy to kill off the buffalo, so to make it more difficult for Native American resistance. Fine, we get that. But out of context, it looks like this guy's killing a buffalo, and we all love the buffalo. So it looks like he's killing the last buffalo. Well, of course he's not. But the people who put this up, in my opinion, didn't think this through. Do you really want to depict Buffalo Bill Cody, who's a very interesting and complex man, as the guy who killed the last buffalo? Because that's what it appears to signify. There are no other buffalo. So often, I think this is the case of the Boston statue you're talking about, Lincoln, with the man bursting out of his chains. They didn't think through the possible misinterpretations. They simply didn't think, well, how could this go wrong? How could this be misinterpreted by someone who doesn't know the history?
To be fair to a lot of people who are designing this process, sometimes things happen after that shape how we think about interpretation that they couldn't necessarily predict. So I don't know when the statue was designed, but I could see in theory future generations being more concerned about preservation than perhaps they were concerned about this preservation. Or maybe I'm giving them too much credit. Maybe this is all recent and they weren't really thinking it through.
It was recent, I'm afraid to say. You wanted it to be 1902, but no, it's the last 20 years.
I think the principle stands, though, that sometimes things do happen that later shift how we think about things. And that's why these things should be reconsidered and revisited.
I think when you build a statue for hereafter, you should say, who might object? How do we know that in 50 years this isn't going to be an embarrassment? Are there things about this human being that we should think more thoroughly about before we make this big, important investment? What do we see that others might not be in a position to see, since we're doing all this research to get ready and we have historical experts, but they're just going to be a tourist wandering through western Kansas? So those sorts of questions seem to me to be ones that we would now really benefit from adopting, like have a rigorous protocol. If you're going to build a statue, here are some case studies that we're showing, but here are some things that you really want to think through as rigorously as possible. So let's take a short break. When we come back, I want to ask you about a couple of more monuments, and then we have to get to Mount Rushmore. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson. David Swenson is on a break. I'm talking with Lindsay Chervinsky, who's well known to Jefferson Hour listeners, this rising and important scholar who wrote The Cabinet about George Washington. As we're on Washington, he owned hundreds of slaves. He did the right thing in his will, at the end of his wife's life, that certain African-American slaves would be freed and so on. Yet he's a large slaveholder, and he was part of the Virginia slaveholding class. He didn't have a great sense of moral urgency about this institution through most of his life. Some people would say we can no longer respect George Washington, certainly not in full measure, because of this. It's not a small thing. This is a gigantic problem of justice, fundamental violation of everything that the United States was expected to stand for. This is the age of the Enlightenment and the rights of man, and here are these people who can talk about slavery, but they almost always are talking about being enslaved to the British Parliament or the British King, so they're misusing the very term slavery in a very self-serving, white superior sort of way. Can the case be made that Washington has to come down off his pedestal?
Yeah, this is probably the question I am most frequently asked, because people are not really sure what to do with his legacy. And I get that. It is complex. It is mixed. What I usually say is that we can both appreciate all of the good and also acknowledge the bad. Maybe for some people that looks like you really respect him, even if you don't really like him. If that's how you want to describe those particular emotions, you can respect and applaud the contribution to the nation while also being really uncomfortable with the personal shortcomings, of which there were many. There are so few people in our history books that don't get taken down a notch if we look at the full story. So, FDR did not own people, but he signed the executive order to intern Japanese Americans, many of whom were loyal American citizens, had been born and raised in this country.
Lincoln believed in repatriation of freed slaves, etc.
Lincoln has some, challenges with...
Right. He suspended habeas corpus during the war.
Now, I'm not saying those are all the same, because I don't know that we necessarily should, rank badness. I think that if we're looking for perfect heroes, we're going to come up with an extremely short list. And the better thing to do is to, rather than viewing it as a hero, because I think generally that sets you up for disappointment, to acknowledge the contributions and the leadership of which Washington was extraordinary in terms of his leadership, while never denying these other things as well.
Well, we can provide some weight, I think. Watergate is not the same as owning other human beings. The Iran-Contra is not the same as buying and selling human flesh. So we can provide some weight on this, and these are grievous. And, Washington is clearly one of the most important men in American history. Remember what Dr. Johnson said in England during this. He wrote a pamphlet against the Americans. He hated us. And he said, why is it that the loudest yelps for liberty come from the drivers of Negro slaves? Exactly. Why is it that the loudest yelps for liberty, I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the Virginians really made the case for the liberation of white people from British rule. You just want Washington to have looked in that mirror a little more often, don't you?
Yeah, and this is where sometimes people say, well, you can't judge people by the standards of their time. And I would say two things to that. One, Washington knew that it was wrong enough to free people by the end of his life, and this was not a deathbed conversion. This was a very gradual process that really started actually with the war and seeing the incredibly courageous and valorous service of Black soldiers. Two, there were plenty of people at the time that were outspoken against slavery, including all of the people that were enslaved. I mean, it's not to say that we shouldn't take some of these things into account, but we can't totally absolve failures using that rhetoric.
They knew better. Jefferson's an even more glaring example. All of his Enlightenment friends, Thomas Paine to Richard Price to Joseph Priestley to Lafayette, I mean, you name the Enlightenment members of what Jefferson liked to call the Republic of Letters. They were all sharp antagonists of slavery. And somehow a tacit agreement was made that they wouldn't bug Jefferson about this. They wouldn't pester him. They wouldn't excoriate him for this, that somehow he would get a kind of a pass. They would agree not to talk about it. For anyone to say, well, they were men of their time, is a silly thing to say, because other men of their time and women understood that this was a fundamental incompatibility in the American Revolution. And for Jefferson to be able to pretend that what are we going to do about this is a really morally questionable stance. And of course, Jefferson is a little more vulnerable than Washington, because Washington didn't say we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So Jefferson is begging for it, right? I mean, he's begging for it, because if you say that, you either mean it or you don't. And if you mean it, you're a fundamental hypocrite.
One other element of this that I think sometimes goes undiscussed, which I think is worth considering. One of the reasons that Jefferson did not emancipate more enslaved individuals was because of his extraordinary debt, that he just simply didn't have the money to do so. And I think whether or not he realized he was doing this, he was leaving the bulk of the people that he owned as the valuable assets to be sold off to cover these debts. In order for Washington to free the over 100 people that he did free, that meant that he had to have an estate that was not riddled with debt. And that was not an accident.
Okay, fair enough. But I mean, I know my Jefferson, he made choices to buy wine, to buy books, to rebuild Monticello. In other words, he always wants debt to appear like it's lightning out of the sky that somehow he was fated by. But he put himself into that desperate debt.
This is really hard to say, because I am not in any way trying to excuse the decades of ownership or to suggest that Washington shouldn't have emancipated people earlier. I think that we often say, oh, well, he freed these people and whatever. I don't think that should be treated too cavalierly, because in addition to making the choice to free those people, he also had to ensure that the estate could financially handle that. And that took also decades of effort. And so I just want to give that tiny bit of credit where it is due, even if it is not enough to at all erase everything else.
Absolutely, I agree. Just let me give you a little statistics here. There are more than 700 Confederate monuments in the United States. About 120 have come down. And here's the list. 1865 to 2014, only 5 objectionable statues in this country were removed. From 2015 to 17, 8. From 2017, which is Charlottesville, 48 in the next 3 years. And after the George Floyd killing in 2020, 110 more. So these are really interesting statistics, I think.
Should we talk about the most ghastly and also probably the most problematic? It's going to be really hard to do something with.
Right, let's talk about Stone Mountain. So I did some research on this. Do you know about this?
It's nuts.
It wasn't completed until 1972. 1972. And it has Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, and Robert E. Lee. It's 16 miles east of Atlanta. It's the largest bas-relief in the world, 90 feet by 190, and it was done as a self-conscious memorial to the Confederacy, and the land on top of it has been used over and over and over again for KKK cross burnings. This is not some Mount Rushmore. This is a monument to white supremacy created in my lifetime on a mountain in Georgia.
Where this mountain took place was considered sort of a sacred site for the Ku Klux Klan. And when there were the revivals in the early 1910s and 1920s, this site became their sacred site where they would have ceremonies, where there would be burnings. The individual who owned this land, his last name was Venable. He deeded the land to the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So let's be very clear about what organization is supporting this. People who are supporting the Confederacy deeded the land to them, wanted a sizable, quote, a Confederacy monument. And as you said, it wasn't completed until the 70s. The 70s, but it was deeded, again, at this time when there was the peak of Jim Crow, it was the peak of lynchings, it was the peak of black codes, and they chose 3 people who either symbolize these things, or Nathan Bedford Forrest is one of the individuals, was the first Ku Klux Klan master, and so was very much intimately involved in inflicting this black terror, and yet it is still on this giant mountain and is the most visited site in Georgia.
The most visited tourist site in Georgia to this day. 1963, a replica plantation was built at the site with happy slaves. And none of the interpretation was this shouldn't have happened. It was all kind of Gone with the Wind depiction of enslaved people. I think that one has to go.
Can't we all agree that that has to go?
I don't see how you can talk about taking down a Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville and leave up this. What do you say?
I feel like surely we can all agree that this one can go. There are other ones that are more complicated. I think Mount Rushmore is perhaps more complicated, but surely we can all agree that this one has to go.
My friend, be careful, because you will get hate mail of unprecedented proportions over this. I mean, there are people that would probably say that they would rather die in a gunfight than have that monument erased. And as late as 2017, the KKK applied for a permit to do a cross burning on top of Stone Mountain. This is not a monument to the unknown Confederate soldier or to the lost cause or to the residual nobility of someone like Robert E. Lee. This is a monument to white supremacy constructed after World War II, which has no other reading except white supremacy. And yet there are people that will be so outraged by hearing you talk about this.
I guess what I would say is, if defending the continued existence of a site that is treasured by the Ku Klux Klan is so important to you that you can no longer trust what I have to say, that is a price I suppose I'm willing to pay.
Fair enough. That one seems obvious. Let's go to the Jefferson Memorial, and then we'll close with Mount Rushmore. Here's my problem with the Jefferson Memorial. First of all, he would want a library, I think. It's a beautiful Palladian structure, but I think a library, the Library of Congress, is a better monument to Jefferson than a memorial in the tidal basin. But secondly, and I've done a lot of work on this, the sayings that are up on the wall are a pastiche of his greatest hits, but they don't tell the whole truth. And so, for example, one of the panels says, "Nothing is more certainly written in the Book of Fate than that this people must and will be free." And anyone from Broken Bow, Nebraska or Seattle who goes there thinks, look, he's against slavery. But what he said in that same statement was, "And once freed must be forever removed from American shores." And so by quoting him out of context in only the most positive ways, they have distorted the record in, I think, fundamentally corrupt ways, maybe innocently done, but corrupt in result. And that this gives a picture of Jefferson which is not adequate to the complexity of the man or the problems in his character and achievement. At the very least, Lindsay, and I know some of this is actually being done, I think it needs an enormous amount of contextualization on site. Of course, I hope they don't tear down the Jefferson Memorial, but if we did, I wouldn't regard it as the worst thing that ever happened. I mean, it seems to me that, why do we get so uptight about this stuff? Donald Trump said during the Charlottesville thing, now it's Robert E. Lee, pretty soon it'll be Washington and Jefferson. And when he said that, I thought, it well might. It well might. And I do take the whole man theory. I think they're infinitely better than a traitor. But I would have a hard time drawing the line and being able to hold to it. What about you?
I personally myself can draw a pretty firm line between Robert E. Lee and Washington and Jefferson, but I understand people who feel that that's more complex or fuzzy, so I don't want to take away a personal, reflection on that. The tidal basin and the monuments in Washington, D.C. are spectacularly beautiful and also deeply problematic, because they are, as you started this conversation, very intentional about which people are selected. They take a very long time to build. The Washington Monument was halfway done during the Civil War. So, and they started talking about it the minute he died. So it's a very long process. It's a lot of very expensive, very big real estate. It's one of the most visited sites in Washington, D.C., if not the country. And it does present a certain dialogue or a certain narrative of American history, which is not always accurate, as you have pointed out, or is very selective about what it says. For starters, I love the inclusion of Martin Luther King facing off with Jefferson. You can't be in the Jefferson and not see Martin Luther King. You can't see Martin Luther King and not see the Jefferson. And I think that is an excellent start because it forces us to think about this partnership. I think major contextualization within the monument would be really essential, but I also agree with you. The Library of Congress is standing at the other end of the mall. I'm in there all the time. It is an exquisite building. It is a phenomenal monument to the best of Jefferson's ideas. And of course, the original building is the Jefferson Building. The Library of Congress started with Jefferson's collection. I think it is a much more fitting tribute. I think it's a tribute he would like a lot better, which is perhaps a very interesting part of it as well.
And we agree 100% on this. I want to draw the line too. I love the Jefferson Memorial, but I believe that nobody should go there without being better informed about the complexities of what's on those walls. The Library of Congress, especially the Jefferson Building, which is one of America's single greatest buildings, I think, contains books by Jefferson, about Jefferson, against Jefferson. A library contains more than one point of view. It contains millions of points of view. And that's what we want. That's the subject of today's conversation with you, Lindsay, that our history is complex. It's impossible to pin down in a simple narrative. A statue is inevitably an oversimplification. A library can contain more books per year. You can pull books off the shelf quietly and put in new books. The ongoing debate about Jefferson continues within the walls of the Library of Congress. It doesn't continue nearly so fluidly in a monument, a celebratory monument like the Jefferson Memorial. What shall we do about Mount Rushmore? This is more potent to me because I live in the Dakotas, and Native American rights and history are extremely important to me, and I object to the carving of anything on that mountain, and I particularly object to the carving of Theodore Roosevelt, who regarded Indians as trouble.
Yeah. So I will start by saying I really have no idea. I generally prefer untainted nature as the best monument to anything. I love seeing nothing human created in nature. It's my favorite thing to see. So I would much rather have an untouched mountain if I had the choice to go back and do a do-over. I don't know that, blasting it off now is really what would be helpful to anybody. I don't know that it wouldn't restore the original mountain. I'm not sure it would restore what Native Americans rightfully view as their land, and I would, I kind of want to give it back to them. I understand that that's problematic, but if we could remove all of the obstacles, that would be my preference. These are all highly implausible and unhelpful suggestions, but that is where I come from.
I'll close by saying, first of all, thank you. Gerard Baker was the Hidatsa, Native American director, superintendent of Mount Rushmore for a long period, and he revolutionized the interpretation there. And that's got to be the first great step, is to make sure that nobody who visits it can kind of have a naive, patriotic tear in the eye without understanding more going on there than Borglum's monument to these 4 American presidents. All right, let's keep talking about this, Lindsay. Thank you. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.